December 18, 1917. The Ypres salient, Belgium. A British lieutenant named James Harrington crouched in what could barely be called a trench, more a frozen scratch in the earth, as German shells screamed overhead. The temperature had plummeted to -15 degrees Celsius. His men, the remnants of a Lancashire regiment, huddled against the icy walls, their greatcoats stiff as boards, their breath forming clouds that froze instantly on their mustaches and eyebrows. 3 soldiers had already died that morning, not from enemy fire, but from exposure. Harrington stared at the pickaxe in his hands, its metal head bouncing uselessly off ground frozen solid as granite. For the first time in 3 years of war, the earth itself had become the enemy. The Western Front, that 400-mile scar across Europe, was grinding to a halt. Not because of German advances, not because of failed offensives, but because winter had arrived with a vengeance unlike anything seen in living memory, and the British Army had no answer for it. Within days, this crisis would force an unprecedented alliance between military engineers and the toughest men Britain had ever produced, men who knew darkness and danger as intimately as breathing, men from the coal mines of Wales and Yorkshire. What they would accomplish in the next 3 months would save thousands of lives and change the nature of trench warfare forever. But on this frozen December morning, as Harrington watched another of his men collapse from hypothermia, that salvation seemed impossibly distant. The winter of 1917 to 1918 arrived like a hammer blow. Meteorological records from the period show it was the coldest winter in Western Europe since 1880. By mid-December, temperatures across the Western Front had dropped to levels that made normal military operations nearly impossible. Snow began falling on December 10th and barely stopped for 6 weeks. Drifts reached heights of 6 feet in some sectors. The Somme region, already devastated by the previous year's offensive, became a frozen wasteland. The Ypres salient, where British forces held a precarious bulge in the German lines, transformed into something resembling the Arctic. But the snow was only part of the problem. The real catastrophe lay beneath it. The ground froze to depths of 3 feet or more. Traditional trench construction, the backbone of Western Front warfare since 1914, depended on the ability to dig. Soldiers had spent 3 years perfecting the art of excavation, creating elaborate networks of frontline trenches, support trenches, communication trenches, all connected by a maze of dugouts and shelters. These positions protected men from artillery fire and provided firing positions against enemy attacks. Without the ability to dig, the entire defensive system collapsed. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Benson of the Royal Engineers filed a report to headquarters on December 20th that painted a dire picture. His men had attempted to extend trench lines near Passchendaele using standard techniques. After 6 hours of backbreaking labor, they had managed to excavate less than 20 yards of trench, and even that was barely 3 feet deep, useless for protection. Pickaxes shattered against the frozen earth. Shovels bent and broke. Even explosive charges, normally effective for rapid excavation, produced minimal results in the frozen ground. The blasts barely scratched the surface, sending shards of ice and rock flying but creating no usable cover. The tactical implications were terrifying. British forces along the Western Front occupied positions that had been fought for at enormous cost. Every yard of ground represented lives spent, blood shed. But without proper trenches, these positions became death traps. German artillery, unaffected by the weather in their ability to fire, continued their bombardments. Shells that would normally explode harmlessly above deep trenches now caught British soldiers in shallow scrapes that offered minimal protection. Machine gun fire, which troops could normally avoid by staying below trench parapets, now found easy targets. Casualty rates from December 15th to December 31st spiked by 40% in some sectors, not from major attacks, but from simple exposure and inadequate cover. Men froze to death at their posts. Others, driven mad by the cold, wandered into no man's land and were cut down. Field hospitals reported a surge in cases of severe frostbite, trench foot that progressed to gangrene and hypothermia. Entire platoons became combat ineffective not because of enemy action, but because the weather had rendered them incapable of fighting. General Sir Douglas Haig, Commander-in-Chief of British forces, faced a nightmare scenario. Spring would bring renewed offensives, the final pushes that everyone hoped would end the war. But if his army spent the winter being slowly destroyed by weather and inadequate fortifications, there would be no one left to launch those offensives. Something had to change, and it had to change immediately. The solution came from an unexpected source. Major William Griffiths of the Royal Engineers had grown up in Merthyr Tydfil, Wales, in the heart of coal mining country. His father and 3 brothers all worked underground. Before the war, Griffiths himself had spent 5 years as a mining engineer, supervising excavations in some of the deepest and most dangerous pits in South Wales. On December 22nd, as he surveyed yet another failed attempt to dig trenches near Armentières, a memory surfaced. He recalled a particularly harsh winter in 1910 when surface mining operations had become impossible due to frozen ground. The miners had adapted, using techniques developed over generations for working in difficult conditions. They had excavated horizontally rather than vertically, created shallow workings with minimal overhead clearance, used timber supports in ways that maximized protection with minimum material, and most crucially, they had learned to work with the cold rather than against it. Griffiths immediately drafted a proposal to his commanding officer, Brigadier General Harold Falk, Chief Engineer of the Second Army. The idea was radical. Instead of trying to dig traditional deep trenches, why not recruit experienced miners who understood underground work in harsh conditions? These men could teach soldiers techniques for rapid shallow excavation, for creating protective positions using minimal digging, for shoring up frozen earth with improvised materials. Most importantly, they could work through conditions that had stopped regular troops cold. The proposal reached General Herbert Plumer, commander of the Second Army, on Christmas Eve. Plumer, known for his meticulous planning and care for his troops' welfare, saw the potential immediately. Within 24 hours, he had authorized the formation of specialized tunneling and fortification companies composed of recruited miners. Orders went out to collieries across Britain. The call was specific. They needed men with experience in difficult excavations, men who had worked in flooded shafts, collapsed tunnels, frozen ground. They needed the best Britain had to offer. The response was overwhelming. By early January, over 800 miners had volunteered, leaving reserved occupations in the coal industry to return to military service. Many had served earlier in the war and been sent back to the mines because coal production was deemed essential. Now they were needed for something else. Among them was Thomas Davies, a 42-year-old shift supervisor from the Rhondda Valley. Davies had spent 30 years underground, starting as a boy of 12. He had survived 3 major cave-ins, had worked seams so narrow he had to excavate lying on his side, had brought out injured men from flooded shafts in pitch darkness. He arrived at the training depot in Rouen on January 8, 1918, along with 50 other Welsh miners. They were issued uniforms, assigned to the 250th Tunneling Company, Royal Engineers, and given exactly 2 days of military training before being sent to the front. The army was that desperate. Davies and his team reached the Ypres salient on January 11th. The temperature was -12 degrees Celsius. Snow fell steadily. They were taken to a section of line held by the 16th Irish Division, where conditions were particularly dire. The trenches here were barely 18 inches deep, offering no protection whatsoever. Soldiers lay in the open, covered by whatever materials they could find: frozen ground sheets, torn sandbags, even corpses of fallen comrades. The divisional commander, Major General William Hickey, met Davies personally. The conversation was brief. Hickey pointed at the frozen wasteland and said simply, "We need cover for 2,000 men, and we need it before the next German bombardment, which intelligence suggests will come in 3 days. Can you do it?" Davies looked at the ground, at the men dying from cold, at the impossible task ahead. Then he nodded. "We will do what we can, sir. But we will need every man you can spare, all the timber in your supply dumps, any heating equipment you have, and complete authority to work as we see fit." Hickey agreed without hesitation. Within an hour, Davies had 300 soldiers under his command, men pulled from reserve positions and placed at his disposal. He organized them into teams of 20, each supervised by an experienced miner. Then he explained what they were going to do, and it was unlike anything the army had attempted before. Traditional trench digging started from the top and went down. You excavated a vertical cut into the earth, removing soil until you reached the desired depth, usually 6 to 8 feet. This provided excellent protection, but required massive amounts of digging in normal conditions, and was impossible in frozen ground. Davies proposed something different. They would dig horizontally, creating shallow scrapes only 2 to 3 feet deep, but much wider, like elongated foxholes. These would be connected by crawl trenches, passages so low that men would have to move on hands and knees, but which required far less excavation. The key was the roof. Instead of leaving positions open to the sky, they would cover them with timber supports and packed snow. The snow, compressed and frozen solid, would provide protection from shrapnel and small arms fire while being much easier to work with than frozen earth. It was a technique Davies had seen used in Welsh mines during winter when surface buildings needed quick construction. The soldiers looked skeptical, but they were too cold and desperate to argue. Work began immediately. The first challenge was breaking through the frozen surface layer. Davies had brought specialized tools from the mines, narrow picks designed for hard rock, wedges that could be hammered into cracks to split frozen earth. But even these struggled against the brutal cold. The solution came from an unexpected source. The army had portable braziers, small metal containers filled with coal or wood, used for heating dugouts. Davies ordered dozens of them brought forward. His teams would light fires directly on the ground where they wanted to dig, let them burn for 30 minutes to an hour, then quickly excavate the softened earth before it refroze. It was painfully slow, but it worked. By the end of the first day, they had created 40 yards of shallow, covered positions. It was not much, but it was 40 yards more than anyone else had managed. The work continued around the clock. Davies organized 3 shifts, with teams rotating every 6 hours to prevent exhaustion and frostbite. The miners taught the soldiers techniques they had learned underground. how to shore up unstable walls with minimal timber, how to recognize when Earth was about to collapse, how to work in confined spaces without panicking, how to move silently because in the mines, noise could trigger cave-ins, and on the front line, noise attracted artillery fire. The soldiers, initially resentful of taking orders from civilians in uniform, quickly developed immense respect for these men. The miners worked with a calm efficiency that came from years of facing death underground. They did not complain about the cold, the danger, the exhaustion. They simply worked. One soldier, Private Michael O'Brien of the Royal Irish Rifles, later wrote in his diary, "These Welsh miners are the toughest men I have ever seen. They work through conditions that would kill anyone else, and they do it without fuss or drama. If we survive this winter, it will be because of them." By January 15th, the 250th Tunneling Company had created over 300 yards of fortified positions. But the real innovation came in how they used the snow itself. Davies realized that the massive snowdrifts, which everyone viewed as obstacles, could become building materials. His teams began constructing walls from blocks of compressed snow, similar to igloos but designed for military defense. These snow walls, backed by timber frames and fronted with frozen sandbags, proved remarkably effective. German machine gun fire could not penetrate them. Shrapnel from artillery shells buried itself harmlessly in the packed snow. The walls could be built quickly, required no excavation, and used materials that were literally everywhere. Within a week, other units along the front were requesting miner teams to teach them these techniques. The War Office, recognizing the potential, authorized the recruitment of 2,000 additional miners. By the end of January, specialized mining companies were operating across the entire British sector of the Western Front. Each brought local knowledge and techniques from their home collieries. Yorkshire miners, experienced with the hard coal seams of the Pennines, developed methods for breaking through particularly stubborn frozen ground. Durham miners, used to working in wet conditions, created drainage systems that prevented positions from flooding when snow melted. Scottish miners from the Lanarkshire pits, accustomed to narrow seams, perfected the crawl trench technique, creating networks of low passages that allowed movement between positions without exposure to enemy fire. The impact on morale was immediate and profound. Soldiers who had spent weeks in barely adequate cover, watching their comrades die from cold and exposure, suddenly had proper protection. The shallow dugouts, while not as comfortable as traditional deep trenches, were warm, dry, and safe. Casualty rates from artillery fire dropped by 60% in sectors where the new fortifications had been built. Deaths from exposure fell even more dramatically. For the first time since December, British troops along the Western Front could sleep without fear of freezing to death. They could move between positions without being cut down by machine gun fire. They could survive German bombardments that would have annihilated them weeks earlier. But the work was far from easy, and the cost was high. On January 28th, Thomas Davies was supervising the construction of a new fortified position near Polygon Wood when a German artillery barrage caught his team in the open. A shell landed directly in the excavation they were working on. Davies and 4 miners were killed instantly. 6 others were wounded. The survivors, rather than retreating, continued working. They finished the position that night, and when asked why they had not withdrawn to safety, one miner, a man named Evan Roberts, simply said, "Thomas would have wanted us to finish the job. That is what miners do. We finish the job." The techniques developed during that brutal winter became standard practice for the remainder of the war. British military engineers incorporated shallow dugout construction and snow fortification methods into their training manuals. The concept of working with environmental conditions rather than against them, of using available materials creatively, of bringing civilian expertise into military operations, all became accepted doctrine. When the spring offensives began in March 1918, British forces launched from positions that had been maintained through the worst winter in memory. The troops were rested, protected, and ready. The German spring offensive, when it came, struck an army that had survived when it should have been destroyed. And when the tide finally turned, when British and Allied forces began their advance in August 1918, the lessons learned in that frozen winter went with them. The miners returned to their collieries when the war ended, most of them never speaking of what they had done. Thomas Davies was posthumously awarded the Military Cross for his leadership and sacrifice. His citation read simply, "For exceptional courage and devotion to duty in the face of extreme danger." But those who served with him knew the truth. He and men like him had saved the British Army when it stood on the edge of collapse. They had taken knowledge earned in the darkness of coal mines and used it to preserve lives in the frozen hell of the Western Front. They had proven that sometimes the most valuable soldiers are not the ones who fight, but the ones who know how to survive. The winter of 1917 to 1918 could have been a catastrophe that changed the course of the war. Instead, it became a testament to British ingenuity, to the value of civilian expertise in military operations, and to the unbreakable spirit of men who had spent their lives facing death underground and were not about to be defeated by ice and snow. When the armistice came on November 11, 1918, and the guns finally fell silent, the shallow dugouts and snow fortifications were abandoned, left to melt and collapse. But their legacy endured in the thousands of lives saved, in the tactical innovations adopted, and in the memory of a winter when the earth itself became the enemy, and Britain found its salvation in the darkness of its coal mines.